Well, thanks so much to both of you for your thoughts, and especially for sharing your family story. I thought it was really interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about educational quality. And you talked about education quality being, school quality being one of the drivers of mobility. And I feel like we all sort of know what that means. You can feel a really good school when you go into it, but I'd love to know how you measure it, and then sort of what we can do to really make our schools better.
So I think there's, school policy is one area here where people have been doing research for a long time, and unlike some of the other factors that I mentioned, like stable families, right? I think we all agree that that's a big thing, but it's a hard thing to you can't just flip a switch from a policy perspective. Educational quality is something I think we do have some good ideas about how to make that work. And I think increasingly, the research shows, first of all, that the quality of the instructors really matters. It makes sense as that they're driving the classroom. There are enormous differences that you see between high and low quality teachers, generating 10, 15 percentage points difference in college attendance rates and hundreds of thousands of dollars in differences in long-term outcomes. Similarly, we now have a very good sense of whether spending more money on schools matters, and the answer is that it does, but you have to do it in the right way, so that doing it to increase the quality of the interaction and the quality of the student experience seems to matter a lot. Having a whole bunch of more back-end administrators, as you might expect, turns out to not really matter that much. And so it turns out that school quality is something I think is both very important, and it's something where we have a pretty clear sense of what to do.
I think a little bit differently on this. I think not so much in terms of schools, I think more in terms of education. And I believe there are 5 things that we need to do, at least here in Providence, but I think that all of them are directly transferable to any city in the country. The first one is that everyone who's been involved in school turnarounds or school work will tell you that it's the culture in the building that matters. You have people who have already committed their careers and their lives to educating kids, and so people are willing to do the work, the hard work, the dirty work, but there has to be a strong culture, a sense of community inside the building. And there's a lot that we need to do there, from empowering principals with flexibility and the resources to run their buildings, and to also supporting our teachers on the front lines so that they feel as though they're making a difference. That's one. The second, maximizing time on task. This is very simple. It's the more you practice, the better you're going to be, the better you're going to get. We can expand the school day, or we can also look for education and learning opportunities outside of the traditional school day. So I'm a big believer in after-school learning, I'm a big believer in summer learning, and I'm also a big believer in connecting our kids to online learning tools so that wherever they are, they can always continue learning. Which leads to the third one. I also believe in personalized, mastery-based learning. We have this practice in Providence, which is not dissimilar from the practice in many cities throughout the country, that we call social promotion. In fact, when kids reach around those middle school years, it's almost a lock that everyone will be promoted and passed on to the next grade. And I firmly believe that we're doing kids a disservice by simply moving them along before they've mastered the material and are ready for what awaits them at the next step. And so personalized instruction, so we go to mastery, but also personalizing instruction so that kids can find their passions. Gone are the days of the traditional textbook. Now if our kids have access to something online, they're not if they have access to this this library, limitless library of material online, they could do a book report on Lionel Messi and his rise as a soccer star, or they could do it on a world leader from a country on the other side of the world. We have to connect kids with their passions. The fourth issue that I believe we have to tackle when it comes to education is social and emotional learning supports. Many of our kids here in Providence, they come to school carrying a lot of challenges and issues from their homes and from their communities. Think about how difficult it is to learn if you're a second grader and you witness your mom being beaten by your dad the night before. You internalize how you handle that. In Providence, many of our kids, frankly, don't get 3 square meals of food a day unless they're in our school system. And so how do you learn if you're not being fed, if you're not, if you don't have that sense of security and safety in the classroom? So we have to do more about social and emotional learning supports for our teachers and for our kids in the classroom. And then the 5th one is, you walk through any of our school buildings and kids know from the moment they step inside whether we're prioritizing them, whether we've deferred maintenance or whether we've stayed up on it. We need to make sure that from the moment our kids walk into the building, they look around and they see that state-of-the-art facilities and technology so that they know that we value them.
It all sounds great if we could do all of that at once. I know it's a long haul to get Providence schools to where we need to get them, but your work is really appreciated. Let me just switch the topic a little bit, and then we're going to open it to questions after a few more. I think about somebody like you. You went to Harvard, is that right? And then you came back to Providence. And, when we think about upward mobility, from Providence's point of view, it's great if students, go off and do great things in the rest of the world, but we really do want them to come back. So how do you think about making sure that the students who are upwardly mobile choose to stay here, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first of all, I did go to Harvard for law school, but I started off at community college, and so I took a different path to get there.
Yeah.
But I was like many of my colleagues and classmates growing up. There was a sense when we were growing up in Providence that Providence was too small and it wasn't a real city, and we couldn't wait until we graduated from high school or college so we could leave, go to a real city, go to a big city, and say goodbye to Providence. And I think that has changed. I think more young people growing up in Providence have pride in Providence and want to come back and be future leaders here. So, I think of what is it that has turned the tide on that? What makes people proud to be from Providence? And first of all, I think that there's a sense of community and belonging that draws people back. So we need to make sure that our young people feel included, that they feel valued. And some of the investments that I mentioned that we've made in young people, that goes a long way. Investments that we make in our public spaces, such as parks, the investments that we make in our programming, bringing people together around the arts, the investments that we make in after-school programs so that they have clubs and different activities that they feel connected to. We want our kids to be as successful as possible, and if that means coming to Brown or going to Stanford or going halfway across the world to get an education, we want to celebrate that, but how do we bring them back? Certainly we have to have the jobs, but there has to be a willingness to come find a job here. And I think it's all these things to create a vibrant and exciting community that creates that pride and Providence that makes them want to come back.
So we've been focusing, and I think the discussion will probably focus mainly on local policy, but I want to talk a little bit about the more macroeconomic picture, if you don't mind, because when you think about the fraction of children who can expect to be better off than their parents, a lot of that has to do with the rate of economic growth at the national level, right? And a lot of that has to do with federal policy, tax policy, a lot of other things that do or don't promote growth. And I guess one first question for John Friedman is, your study looks at the mobility of children who grew up in the 80s and 90s. Right?
That's right, it's mostly...
Because you have to see them at age 35.
That's right, think about being born between about 1980 and 85.
Yeah, exactly. And so now the children who you're trying to support now, these are children who maybe were born during or shortly after the Great Recession. And I guess the question for you is, do you see kind of big macro trends that make you feel better or maybe even more concerned about the degree of social mobility in the less? I know it's hard to predict the future. These kids aren't grown up yet, but...
No, so
Yeah.
I think that's a critical question that you ask. And I think that you're right. If you think about the broad drivers of that graph that I started with, there are basically two factors. One is how fast is average growth in the country, right? If we're multiplying by 10 incomes from one generation to the next, that's going to make it much easier for everyone to do better than their parents. But then the second thing, which is a very critical factor, is the distribution of that growth. Are we growing in a way such that more or less all the different parts of the income distribution are growing at the same pace and growth is broadly shared? Or are we growing in a way where growth is concentrated, as we've seen it in the last 3 decades or so, towards the top of the income distribution so that income inequality is growing? Now, it turns out that both of those factors, both slower overall growth and more skewed distribution of growth, have contributed to that declining American dream plot that I showed you. But it turns out if you could pick kind of to reverse one of the changes, that is, I could either pick to have overall growth rates the way we had it back in the 50s and 60s, or I could pick to have a more equitable distribution of growth, the way we had it back in the 50s and 60s, but with lower growth as we've seen it in the 80s and 90s. It turns out it would be much more important to fix the distribution of growth than fix the overall level of growth. And so what that's saying is that if only we had a more equitably distributed growth path, just with the same kind of 2–2.5% growth that we do see today, but if we could make it so that instead of most of the gains going to the top 10 or the top 1%, they were more broadly distributed throughout the income distribution, then in fact you would see a pretty large change in the numbers that I showed you being about 50%, and we back up around 75%. Wouldn't quite be at the 90%, you'd need to have faster overall growth for that. But if only we could get a broader shared growth, I think that would make a huge difference. And so then we can think about a lot of the changes federally and that affect these types of things. And I think you see that we've had some tax changes over the years which have broadly advantaged people that have a lot of money or have a lot of wealth. And we've seen other tax changes over the years that have led to more broad-based growth, either through targeted tax credits like the earned income tax credit, or through the types of policies that really foster growth for those at the lower end of the income distribution. And I think policies like that are going to be that's where federal policy needs to focus to complement the type of local policy efforts that the mayor was talking about.
Mm-hmm. And Mayor, do you see, are there any sort of federal policy changes that are hindering or helping you advance your mobility agenda, or do you just kind of say the federal government does what it does, I'm going to focus on what I do?
I mean, to a certain extent. So the currency of purchase in my world is solving problems.
Yeah.
And it's to solve a problem, you have to take reality for what it is, as opposed to how you want it to be. And so I almost take the federal government's position, and whether they are or aren't a partner, as a given. That's a starting point, and we do what we can with what we have. Now there are certain things that I'd like to see from the federal government. Most of the resources that we get from the federal government that we apply to this comes through the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG. And every year there's a proposal to cut CDBG money, and then you have champions in Congress that restore some of the funding. But we've seen a market decline in these dollars. I believe about 30 years ago, the city used to get about 20 million in CDBG dollars from the federal government. Today we get less than $5 million. So that's one. The second thing is, there's a lot that we want to do at the local level, and we can do it on our own if we have to. But it would be great to have a federal partner there along with us. So there's a lot of talk at the federal level, but there's a lot of action at the local level. There's been talk about $1 trillion infrastructure plan at the federal level. However, in the past election cycle, cities throughout the country approved through referendum over $300 billion worth of infrastructure investments. This is just in one cycle. So it's happening at the local level, and it would be great to have more of a partner. But in the absence of federal leadership, the challenges still exist at the local community, and we have to find solutions for them.
So just one last question before we open the floor. Are you going to do more work on Providence, and are you going to do more work together? How's that going to go?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So John and I have been working on this idea that we're calling the Children's Accord. And Baron has been involved in this very deeply through Dr. Ken Wong. And the Children's Accord is a play on the Paris Climate Accord. In the absence of federal leadership, how do we get municipal and county leaders to step up and fill that void? And by simply being aware of the data, is there a way that we can get mayors and county leaders throughout the country to lean into the issues of social and economic mobility so that they can leverage more resources? Second, also by highlighting the initiatives that move the lever on social and economic mobility, perhaps we can accelerate the process of replication. And third, and this speaks to the point that I mentioned earlier, if by coordinating our activities we can amplify the voice of mayors and county leaders, that collectively we can drive the national agenda, again, on social and economic mobility. So we're working together at the local level on income mobility here, but we're also looking at how do we create a network and a movement of mayors and county leaders throughout the country that have this at the top of their agenda.
And John, you're working in cities around the country, right?
That's right. What we've realized is that taking research like this and just sticking it up on the web is not enough. We need to walk beyond that, and that's not to say that we can design policies all ourselves. It's critical to be working with partners like the mayor who really understand what's going on in a given place and understand what the local community needs and kind of what it will bear in terms of different policies. But part of what our organization does is have a policy team where people spend all of their days going out and meeting with different policymakers and helping to organize and design different policy interventions, like the housing voucher pilot that I told you about, like some of the work we're doing in Charlotte, North Carolina to try to increase some extremely low levels of upward mobility there. I think that's a critical piece of this work. Research like this is not meant to sit in academic journals. It's meant to be out in the world and being used, and we want to be a part of that.
Good. Well, thanks to both of you for your responses. We're going to open the floor to questions. I think we have people with microphones, right? And these are rather long rows. So if you want to have a question or comment, raise your hand and you'll have a microphone passed to you. So right here.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Brenda Clement. I'm director of Housing Works Rhode Island, affiliated with Roger Williams University. And so housing advocates like me say all the time that the path to opportunity begins at your front door. And I think your research shows that all over the place. Just one comment, because you've talked so eloquently already about kind of housing and housing needs and where people live. But I just wanted to put this into context. We are working on a source of income bill that's actually scheduled for a hearing tomorrow, that right now in Rhode Island, landlords can discriminate against somebody based on their source of income. So if they have a housing voucher, it means that they can turn that down or refuse to accept that person because their source of payment of their rent or part of their payment of rent is their voucher. So it's working on practical solutions like that, and just wanted to put into context that what you're talking about is very real in Rhode Island and very real in Providence, and we're trying to work on solutions.
Thank you.
So my question is, sorry, I forgot that part, is kind of what the experience and some initial takeaways from your Seattle project about the voucher project, and how can we see more mobility and more willingness of landlords to accept vouchers?
Are you allowed to talk about that?
Yeah, I can talk about kind of the formal results will come out over the summer, but I think what's important to know for these purposes, that it seems to have been very successful across a broad range of outcomes. I think what we found was that it's very important to make sure that you're really thinking about how to make landlords really want to be part of the program, right? It turns out that Section 8 is actually a really stable, great source of income if you know about that, and if you kind of get through the various hurdles to get there. And so part of what we did was to have a few programs on the landlord side just, we weren't making any drastic changes to the system, but just kind of easing a few things that people found to be barriers to joining to the program. So just to give you an example, when you rent your apartment on the private market, usually you take first and last month's rent right up front, and that kind of provides at least a minimum of stability that some money is coming in, and especially from a liquidity perspective, you may not have been renting the apartment recently, that immediate cash being right there at the beginning is helpful. As far as I know, Section 8 takes a little while to start paying the landlord, and so even though it's a reliable source of money, waiting a month or 2 months for those rent checks to start coming in might not be something that people can afford or people want to deal with. And so just little stuff like that, I think, and obviously we shouldn't have landlords be discriminating based on their source of income, but we also want to make this a program that people want to be a part of, and it's seen as like kind of a really good source of income.
Good. Next question. I think we have one over here.
Hi, Professor Friedman. This is about your research. I was wondering how your research is different from the 1992 moving to opportunity policies, because they found no significant labor market outcomes from the voucher programs, and that with the follow-up study from that, and also they found a significant effect on women's mental health from that study also, and I was wondering how maybe that can be captured by some of your data.
That's a great question. So just to bring everyone kind of up to speed, the federal government funded a housing voucher policy or pilot project in the 1990s, where in 5 cities across the country, they recruited families living in what were really not very good kind of large public housing projects, and gave families 2 different types of vouchers. One was a standard Section 8 voucher, and then the second type was a voucher that was very similar to Section 8, except it was restricted to being used in a low poverty neighborhood. I think you couldn't have a poverty rate above 10%. And you're right, so the initial studies of that found that it didn't really help things for the adults as they moved out of these neighborhoods, and there's some evidence that the adults were happier though. What more recent research, looking back to that original set of studies, found, however, is that there were big impacts on the kids. And when kids moved into these lower poverty neighborhoods, you saw pretty large gains later in life when you measured them as adults, if the kids moved at an age that was early enough so that they really could have some exposure to the new neighborhood. And that really links back to what I showed you, where if you move to a new neighborhood at age 19 or something like that, it's almost as though you didn't move there at all. Whereas if you move to a new neighborhood at age 10 or 12, you may not get all of the benefits as if you had moved there when you were born, but you get many of the benefits. And so very similarly to that, they've shown that the MTO kids that move to these better neighborhoods at early ages in life seem to be doing much better. Income increases on a scale of like 30% more income that they're earning in their late 20s. Now, how does what we're doing in Seattle differ from MTO? The key thing in MTO is that they targeted neighborhoods based on statistics about the adults living there now. So they target the poverty rate, but there are lots of other measures. For instance, there's an institute in Ohio that puts together a thing called the Kirwan Index. It's a combination of segregation and poverty and a bunch of these other variables that you might think about for measuring the quality of neighborhoods. Now, it turns out that while each of those things is correlated with opportunity for kids, there's really no substitute for just looking directly at that. And so if you only target low poverty neighborhoods, you're going to find neighborhoods that are a little bit better in terms of opportunity, but not nearly as much better as you could get if you just directly targeted high opportunity areas. And so in fact, you can go back to the old MTO studies and put together kind of a little simulation. You could say, well, given the gains that we observed for kids in the neighborhoods where they did move, what would have happened if they actually moved to the high opportunity neighborhoods? And then you make sure that they're not moving any further than they did, they're not moving to any more expensive neighborhoods than they did, and other things like that. And it turns out you can more than double the effect of the MTO if only you focus on these high opportunity neighborhoods. And so that's what we're doing in Seattle, really trying to not focus on some other thing, but just really look at where do we observe kids getting on really good trajectories. It's oftentimes a low poverty neighborhood, but sometimes it's not. It's oftentimes a less segregated neighborhood, but sometimes not. And kind of wherever we see opportunity, we're helping families find that. And again, kind of preliminarily, things seem like they're really working.
But there's a good cautionary tale in that question, which is if you look at follow-up, if you try to find big effects too soon, you're not going to find them.
That's right.
And here you are looking now, their kids are in their 20s and they're doing much better, whereas you couldn't see that a year after.
That's right.
It's
with the kids, you really have to give it time. It's not this, oh, if only we magically fix things at one age, things will be better thereafter. The other key distinction, right, is a focus on the kids rather than on the adults. Fixing where adults are in life turns out to be really, really hard. There's some things that you can do, and it's not like we should give up on people, but broad-based policies like that to really improve the economic outcomes of adults turn out to be really, really hard. Whereas for kids, things seem to be much more malleable. And so I think that's part of why I think when you look in the data and you think about things from a social mobility perspective, like the mayor and many others are doing, I think this focus on children and thinking about not just how do we make sure that there are jobs here today for adults, but that our community is one which puts kids on the right path such that there is social mobility from our community. I think that's a critically important piece of policy that too often is really not at the forefront, but it's great that it's really now, I think, getting to the forefront of the conversation.
Good, thank you. So I can't see all the hands, so I'm going to let I think this person right here had her hand in the middle. Thanks.
I have two questions, and so you choose either of them, or none of them, I guess. One is that you've spoken quite a bit about the great work that's been done and opportunities for improving social mobility through education and housing, but haven't heard much about health and whether or not health is another route, both of the families themselves and the children, and whether or not there are opportunities there in terms of improving social mobility. A second question is how you do evaluations of interventions, because you are starting with the benefit of a 35-year time frame to look at whether or not to identify these high opportunity areas, but it's unclear whether these intermediate outcomes that you could possibly measure within an evaluation time frame that could be useful for guiding social policy can be done. So I'm just kind of interested in what kind of intermediate outcomes you look at.
Sure. I'll share with you something that we're starting to think about and starting to do here in Providence. Almost every health expert will tell you that housing is one of the social determinants of health. Yet when you ask them what kind of housing work are you doing, their portfolio of work in this space is very limited. And when we talk about health organizations, it's not just hospitals, but also the insurers. And so, right now we're thinking about bringing the insurance companies to the table now and asking them to invest some of their community benefit dollars to creating more affordable, high quality affordable housing. And I know this is a bit of a broken record, but in every community, there are a number of people who can do it, but I think that there is one person, the mayor, that's in the best position to convene all of these different stakeholders, being in touch on a regular basis with health insurance, with the health insurance industry, being in touch on a regular basis with folks, with housing advocates. You're in a perfect position to have them, bring them to the table and have them talk to each other. So those are some conversations and some ideas that we're working on right now. And I think that we can make the case, not just from good social policy, but also a dollars and cents case, that the health insurance companies should be investing in this space and over the long term and be in their best interest.
So I can talk a little bit about the how do you figure out whether things are working, and I think this is also a really critical piece of making the leap between research and policy. When we first started about what we might do in Providence, we said, well, we'll put a pilot here, a pilot there, and then I'll track the kids into adulthood, and I'll come back 25 years later, and I'll tell you whether it worked or not. And the mayor didn't seem quite as happy with that as maybe I had hoped. You've got to be able to figure out whether the stuff is working on a real timeline. And that's a challenge that cities face, it's a challenge that schools face, it's a challenge that universities face. Anytime where there's a gap between what you can measure now and what you really think are the long-term outcomes that we really deep down care about, this is a key challenge. And I think the benefit of these type of historical data that we now have available increasingly to study these types of programs is that we can not only look today at what are the long-term outcomes from the types of policies like the MTO moved opportunity that happened in the 1990s, but there's also a lot of intermediate data where we can ask, for instance, in the context of MTO, what did that look like 3 or 4 years in? And what can we learn from that experience about how to recognize success where there is success, how to recognize failure when there is failure, before we have to wait 20 years. Now, there still is not going to be a substitute for waiting 20 years, right? There's just information that you're not going to know. But in most cases that I've seen, with the right data, you can actually figure it out in the short term. And of course, exactly what you're going to look at in the short term is largely going to be data dependent. And in the best case scenario, you just actually want to let the data tell you what are the right intermediate proxies for success. And so, for instance, in the case of MTO, a lot of looking at engagements between some of these, overwhelmingly minority and relatively, still young, either kind of older, younger teenagers, older teenagers in the criminal justice system in school. That was one thing that seemed to be pretty predictive of long-term stuff, even in the early data back then. Especially with school interventions, there's been a lot of good work showing that not only test scores, but also a lot of what some people call non-cognitive tests, or how children are behaving with others. Are they being suspended? Are they falling into other types of disciplinary problems? Those seem to be pretty predictive of long-term stuff. But it's very context dependent, and it's a critical piece. So I don't have a general answer for you. All to say is that there is a way to do this, and I think that it's a very important piece of this type of evaluation. You've got to figure out what are you going to look at in the short term to make sure that you're on the right path in the long term.
And some of the things the mayor mentioned, like summer learning loss, right? That's something you can pretty easily measure.
That's right.
And I think we know that that matters over the long run. So that work is really important. Again, I can't, the lights are very bright. I'm trying to see. I have a lot of hands up down here. So why don't we start here and work our way over?
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm embarrassed to ask a really simple, stupid question. But your data seems extraordinarily complete and remarkably specific. Can you just spend a minute discussing, and your confidence level in your data is very high. So can you just spend a minute explaining to me how you get these data and how they can be so complete?
Sure, that's a great question. I think your question really hits at the root of what I think has been a data explosion that's happened in the social sciences and kind of policy relevant research fields over the past 10 to 15 years. The key thing is to use so-called administrative data sources. What does administrative mean? It means that the data are collected for some other purpose than purely whatever study it is that I or anyone else wants to do. So how is that different from, I think, more traditional research practices? So traditionally, someplace like the census or the Bureau of Labor Studies would go out and conduct a survey where they'd ask 1,000 people some set of questions, and then researchers would try to use those data in order to learn whatever they wanted to learn. And you can easily see the problems to that, even if you're just interested in learning what's going on at a given moment in time, but especially then if you're interested in following those individuals over time, you'd have to go actually find those 1,000 people again, which is really hard, and you just lose track. And so what researchers have done instead with these administrative data sources is taken data whose main purpose is not research, but they're collected for the purpose of tracking how kids are doing in schools, or in the context of the IRS, what incomes of people have earned and taxes they're owed. And those data sets can basically be repurposed to understanding some of these broad social problems. And so just to give you an example of that, one of the very early papers I wrote using these data looked at a long-run follow-up of an experiment that happened in Tennessee in the 1980s, where kids in kindergarten were put into different classrooms. And that study tried to track the kids over about the next 10 years with reasonable success. We came back about 15 years later, and in fact, we were able to find a wage for these children at age 27 for a larger share of those kids that initially started in kindergarten than they had a test at the end of kindergarten for. Right, so just to give you a sense, right, we were able to find something like 95% of them, and that data is what enables all of this to happen. And so it's, there are a lot of different sources for this now, but broadly it's the advent of administrative data like this that have really enabled studies like this and policies like the mayor is now talking about.
And I think it's worth highlighting that this is done with the utmost attention to confidentiality.
Yes.
You don't get individuals' names.
That's right. It's all anonymized, and so it's all anonymized records.
So don't get,
Yeah, in fact, there's a whole now
Yeah.
science of how to do this in a way called differential privacy, where you do it in a way where you only release the information that is necessary without releasing it in a way that could compromise individuals. But right, at the end of the day, if you're releasing statistics on tens of thousands of individuals, the risk to any individual is kind of infinitesimally small. That's why this is able to work.
So I think we only have time, sadly, for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. And what I thought we could do is collect randomly from around the room 3 questions, and then each of you have a chance to ask their group of people. I can't take all your questions. So with the microphone, randomly pick one of these gentlemen and give him a microphone. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Rohan. I'm a student at Brown. I'm a student on a think tank called Brown Institute for Policy. One of our sub-teams is looking at the state of mental health in Rhode Island. And I know Mayor Alorza, you mentioned SEL programs. I guess I have some questions related to that. I guess, one, could you elaborate on what SEL kind of programs you guys are developing here in Providence? And for Professor Friedman, could you talk about, I guess, if you're looking as part of the Opportunity Atlas at relationships between mental health factors and social mobility, or if that kind of research exists in the literature?
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's collect another question from up here.
In addition to taking children and moving them into more affluent neighborhoods, my question is, what about access to healthy water? Because we know that children who are exposed to lead, either in water or paint, have very high cases of ADHD, right? So there's the water. What about training the police force? I'm worried, not worried, but I can just see that without a police force who is aware of what is happening, we're going to end up with like a Trayvon Martin incident or a Starbucks incident where you now have, I mean, we do have neighborhoods that are predominantly white, and all of a sudden you're going to have an influx of different people, which I think is great, but the police need to be kind of trained so that we don't have incidents that we've seen happening in other parts of the country. And I think that's my full question.
Okay, and then we're going to pick one more. So we have mental health, water, policing, and right here.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I was interested in how Providence's economic trajectory compared to other places in America and how that reflects the city's greater socio-political trajectory.
Thank you. Okay, that gives you both something to work with.
So I'll start off with SEL, and I think that the SEL program that I'm proudest of and that I'm most excited of is the restorative justice practices that we've implemented in our schools. And restorative justice is effectively, instead of punishing kids, suspending them, giving them detention, and not addressing the root cause of the issue, you get to having that child, that person, recognize and articulate the harm that they've caused to the community, and also take accountability and take steps for how they're going to restore the community from the harm that they've caused. And it's been really remarkable, the impact that we've had in Providence. We've reduced our out-of-school suspensions dramatically. I think it's something like 40 or 50% year over year by investing in restorative justice and changing our policies. I'll also give you one story that ties into our summer jobs programs and our investment in people. We partner with outside organizations that have relationships and can connect with kids that we simply don't have direct connections with in City Hall. So we partner with the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence, and we funded a summer jobs program. There was a 20-year-old kid who got his first summer job through this program. I went to his graduation, and I'll always remember what he said. He was so thankful and appreciative when he got his graduation certificate. He said, when I came in for an interview, they asked me, what are you going to do if you don't get this job? He said, if I don't get this job, I'll likely go out and mug someone later on today, like I did last night. And I'll do it until I get caught and end up at the ACI again, like I have since I was 14 years old. And talking the value of a small investment that we can make to helping a young man get his life back on track. And we've been so impressed by this young man that he is now working in one of our middle schools, working with at-risk kids, and providing some of that social emotional learning support and teaching restorative justice practices inside of the school. So there's a way that we can connect these all together. But we do things such as practicing mindfulness in the classroom, practicing concentration, practicing empathy and compassion. And we have a sticker system that we now reward kids in the elementary grades, so that they can feel as though this is something that we value and we want to encourage them doing more of it. So there's a whole package around social and emotional learning that we brought into the school department.
Can you do anything on mental health with your data?
We can actually, and it turns out that mental health is the key driver, not just of all the problems that you're describing, but of young adults leaving the workforce to go on disability. And we can actually measure this, and we found some kind of two key facts that I'll tell you about the intergenerational roots of mental health as measured in disability. So the first thing is that we think of the immediate presence of mental health as something that can lead to the type of destabilization that puts kids on the wrong path. But it turns out that in the data, in the same way that I showed you that earnings have these local childhood roots, the same thing is going to be said in mental health. So for instance, families growing up in the same place, a rich family versus a poor family is about 5 times less likely to have a child grow up to be mentally disabled in this way. We're thinking about extreme cases of stress and other things that cause young adults in their 20s and early 30s to go on a disability. The other thing we see, which is a really striking pattern, and gives you a sense of how these things really, they just don't all align in the same way. So for most of the types of outcomes you can look at whether kids go to college, you can look at whether kids are earning good wages when they grow up from a given place, they all kind of align. Even if you look at something like incarceration, it's not perfectly correlated with employment or more economic outcomes, but they're pretty well correlated. A place that tends to put kids on a pathway towards lower incarceration rates or higher economic outcomes, those tend to go together. With disability and mental health, it's actually the reverse. Places that tend, all else equal, to put kids on a path towards higher economic outcomes and lower incarceration rates generate higher rates of mental disabilities and mental health related disabilities for kids in their 20s and 30s.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so to be totally honest, I do not understand exactly what's going on, but if I were to make a map for you of disability driven by mental health cases across the US, it would basically look like the reverse of the map that I showed you, and some of the highest mental health rates from kids growing up in the country are in states like Massachusetts and New Hampshire, actually. So,
wow.
President, if I could just answer the young lady's question about the economic trajectory of the city. At a macro level, the job growth has been relatively flat. But if you look at what has happened over the past several years, we're at a bit of an inflection point. So there's been more development in the city than we've had in a generation. The property values are higher than, increases are higher than we've seen in a very, very long time. And people are visiting the city as well. So our vacancy rates at our hotels are as low as they've been in anyone's memory. So, you know, people want to live here, people want to invest here, people want to visit here. All of those are great, great signs. But the reality is that Providence already ranks in the top 5 cities. Think about all the cities in the country. We rank in the top 5 in income inequality. So already we start off at a very difficult place in terms of economic distribution. And I'm deeply, deeply concerned. If we are at an inflection point and progress is going to continue to come to the city, are people who currently live here, who currently work here, are they going to be able to afford living in the city? A friend of mine often says, you know, sometimes a rising tide only lifts the yachts. And instead we want every boat to be lifted. And unless we're actively or proactively working to address income inequality, left on its own devices, I see income inequality actually growing.
Yeah, good, thank you. There was one other question, water quality, policing. I don't know if you look at either of those things in your data, John.
So we've studied lead. What we found to be, if you look at lead coming from housing construction, which I think is not in extreme cases like Flint, but overall the largest source of lead, you can learn a lot about the lead in a housing stock basically from when the houses were built and from when they phased out lead paint. And so that is a pretty strong correlate of mobility across counties in the United States. We don't have it done at the block level just due to the data issues, but lead seems to be a real issue. We know less about criminal justice. It seems that it must be extremely important, especially for kids coming from certain backgrounds, or the incarceration rates of especially black men are off the charts in a way that the engagement with the criminal justice system has to be a very important aspect of that. But we're actually in the process of gathering data on different policing practices and how they've changed across neighborhoods from a large city in order to really be able to study this in much more detail. But my instinct is that's very important. I just don't have anything for you now.
So let me just thank both of you for coming. It's great to see the conversation between the two of you, and Mary, your commitment to lifting all boats, not all yachts. I love that. And thanks, John, very much for your great work. And thanks for everybody for coming.